The moment I stepped into the front hallway and caught the smell, I knew. That rich, briny sweetness of boiling lobster is unmistakable, and it hit me before I'd even closed the door behind me. Before I'd counted the extra pairs of shoes lined up along the entry mat, before I'd heard the voices, before any of it, my body understood first. There was this particular stillness that moved through me, starting at the base of my throat and working its way down. Not quite nausea, not quite rage. Something older and quieter than both of those things. I stood in the hallway with my work bag still over my shoulder and my winter coat dripping February slush onto the ceramic tile. I had just driven 45 minutes in stop-and-go traffic on the link to get home. I had thought about those lobsters at least 4 times during my afternoon caseload, somewhere between a home visit in the East End and the documentation that was still waiting on my laptop. 2 whole Atlantic lobsters from the Dundas Farmers Market, $34 a pound, $88 total, which is not an amount I spend on dinner without a specific reason. The specific reason was that I had finally, after 14 months of covering a colleague's maternity leave at a pace that was quietly hollowing me out, been told that morning that my caseload was going back to normal in 2 weeks. I had texted Malcolm from the market parking lot at noon, grabbed lobsters from the market. Celebrating tonight, he had replied, "You deserve it." Malcolm's mother, Paulette Renwick, did not live in our condo. I want to be clear about that first. But she had a key. Before I get to that Thursday evening, I need to tell you something about how we got there, because none of it makes sense without the years behind it. My name is Elise. I'm 33 years old. I work as an occupational therapist for a community health organization in Hamilton, Ontario, which means I spend my days in other people's homes, helping them navigate how to live safely and independently after illness or injury. It is work I find genuinely meaningful. It is also work that asks you to hold a great deal of other people's difficulty every single day, which means that by the time I get home, I'm usually running low on the kind of patience that looks like flexibility. I don't say this to excuse what happened that evening. I say it because it's the truth of what I was carrying when I opened that door. My apartment, our condo technically, is on the 3rd floor of a mid-rise building in the lower city. We've been here 4 years, Malcolm and I. We're common law, which in Ontario is simply what we share: a mortgage, shared finances, a shared life. We talked about a formal wedding in the early years, and then again more seriously after the pandemic. But we bought this place instead, and then the renovation happened, and then my colleague went on mat leave and the timing never quite aligned. Marriage is still a conversation we have. I'm not in a rush. What I want to be clear about is that common law is not a lesser thing. I have never felt that it was. What we have is real, and I have never needed a ceremony to know that. Malcolm is 36. He works in municipal project management, which suits him. He's organized, patient, genuinely skilled at logistics. All qualities that make him excellent at his job and occasionally baffling at home, where those same skills seem to get stored behind a particular wall when it comes to his mother. I spent a long time telling myself I was imagining that pattern. I'm not sure I imagined it. Paulette Renwick is 67 years old. She retired 3 years ago, after 30 years as a vice principal at a high school in Burlington, which is about 40 minutes from us along the 403. She lost Malcolm's father, Gerald, to a cardiac event 18 months before that retirement, which meant the 2 things, the loss of her husband and the loss of her professional identity, happened almost simultaneously. I have never stopped believing that this broke something open in her that she hasn't fully found a way to close. I am not unsympathetic. I have tried, genuinely and for years, to hold that understanding while also holding everything else. She is a woman of strong opinions and considerable energy, who has a particular certainty that her way of doing things is the correct way. In a school administrator, that is probably an asset. In someone else's home, it is something else. When Malcolm and I first moved in together, Paulette and I managed a kind of courteous coexistence. She was never warm to me exactly, but she wasn't cruel either. She had someone else in mind for him, I always sensed, though she never said so. After Gerald died, the distance between us shortened in ways that were subtle at first and then less so. Malcolm gave her a key to the condo 8 months after his father passed. "For emergencies," he said. "She has a long drive, it just makes sense." I told myself it was fine. She was grieving. She needed to feel close to him. That was 2.5 years ago. What followed was not dramatic, at first. It was incremental, the way these things tend to be. She would let herself in on a Tuesday while I was at work and be gone before I got home. But the kitchen cupboards would be reorganized. Her sense of order imposed over mine. Casserole dishes, where the mixing bowls had been no explanation, just the new arrangement presented as obvious improvement. She would stop by on a Saturday afternoon while Malcolm was running errands, and tell me, in her efficient, authoritative way, that she'd tidied the front closet while she was waiting, that it had been getting cluttered. She called my work line twice. I had given her the number years ago for genuine emergencies, and both times it was not an emergency. The second time, she left a message with my front desk coordinator asking me to call her back when I was free. My coordinator was puzzled about it for a week. I started keeping notes, not out of spite, out of the same instinct that makes me document my caseload. If you don't write it down, the pattern disappears. On the days when I told myself I was overreacting, being too sensitive, not giving enough allowance for grief and for good intentions, I needed something concrete to look at. So I kept the notes. A file on my phone titled simply P, the date, the incident, 1 or 2 lines. By that February evening, there were 38 entries. I did not know yet that those entries were not evidence I was gathering against Paulette. They were evidence I was gathering for myself. I should tell you about the recipe binder because it matters more than any of the rest of it. My mother died when I was 26. Ovarian cancer, 13 months from diagnosis to end. She was 54. She left me a few things, a modest amount of money that went toward our condo down payment, her winter parka, which I still wear every February, and a 3-ring binder of recipes. It was not a beautiful object, not an heirloom in any polished sense. A regular white binder from Staples, stuffed with index cards in her handwriting, with magazine clippings held in crinkled plastic protectors, with a few pages printed from early food blogs that no longer exist. She'd kept it on the kitchen counter her whole adult life, the way a binder like that just lives somewhere and becomes part of the room. I kept it on mine. 5 months before that February evening, Paulette was in our condo on a Wednesday afternoon. Malcolm was at a site visit. I was with clients. When I came home that evening, the binder was not on the counter. I asked Paulette, who was still there finishing her tea, where it had gone. She said she'd moved it. It was cluttering the counter. She thought it belonged somewhere else. We looked. It was not in the pantry. It was not on the shelf by the cookbooks. It was not anywhere we could find. After an hour of searching, Paulette said, carefully, that she might have put it in the donation box. The box that Malcolm had dropped at the Goodwill bin on Upper James that afternoon, on his way home from the site. She said she thought it was just old clippings. She hadn't realized it was mine. She hadn't realized it mattered. Malcolm held my hand that night and told me he was sure it was an accident. I told him I was sure it was too. I believe that. I still believe it. But the binder was gone, and every card in my mother's handwriting, was gone with it, and that accident had happened because Paulette had been in our home making decisions about what stayed and what went without asking anyone. I put it in the file titled P Entry Number 31. By February, I was at 38. The Thursday in question started with genuinely good news. My manager called me into her office at 9 in the morning and told me that the colleague I'd been covering was coming back in 2 weeks and my case numbers were returning to normal. I walked back to my desk feeling something I hadn't felt in months, which was close to lightness. At noon, I drove to the Dundas Farmers Market on my lunch break. I stood at the fish counter and I bought 2 Atlantic lobsters, $34 a pound, $88 in total, more than I would ordinarily spend on a weeknight dinner. I texted Malcolm in the parking lot. I thought about those lobsters 4 separate times during my afternoon appointments. I thought about the bottle of Niagara Chardonnay I'd been keeping on the wine rack since October, a bottle from a small winery we'd visited in the fall. I thought about eating at our own table, with no deadline the next morning worth losing sleep over. I got on the highway at 5:40. I was home at 6:25. I heard it before I opened the door. A table full of people laughing, the loose, full laughter of women who have just eaten well. I stood in the hallway outside our unit with my key in my hand and made myself take one slow breath. Then I opened the door. The smell hit me first. The lobster. Cooked, already finished, based on the shells piled on my good serving plate, the one we use for actual occasions. Then I took in the rest of it. The dining table extended with the spare leaf from the closet, seating 6. Paulette positioned nearest the kitchen, as she always managed to be. 3 women I had never seen before in my life, sitting at chairs that were normally mine. My cloth napkins, the good ones from the bottom drawer, were on their laps. My Chardonnay, the October bottle, stood open on the table with 4 glasses poured around it. On the counter behind Paulette, my large stockpot sat drained and rinsed. She'd cleaned up after herself. Somehow that made it worse. Malcolm was at the far end of the table. He had the grace to look uncomfortable, which I noticed and filed away. Paulette looked up when I stepped inside, and her face did the thing I had watched it do before. It rearranged itself into a particular warmth, preemptive and practiced, the expression of someone who has already calculated that charm is the better opening move. "Elise, you're home!" She said my name the way someone says a word they're hoping will carry the weight of an entire explanation. Come in, sit down." The lobster went fast. Honestly, it was so fresh it seemed a shame to wait. But there's plenty of rice on the stove, and I think there's still some chowder from last week in the back of the fridge. You must be completely done in. I was still standing in my own doorway. I had not taken off my coat. My bag was on my shoulder. One of the women, she had a silver-white bob and reading glasses pushed up on her head, gave me a small, uncertain smile. The smile of a person who is just beginning to understand that they have walked into something. Malcolm looked at me, then he looked away, and then back at me, and he said in the careful, casualized voice he uses when he needs something to not become a thing. "Hey, maybe you could just grab a plate and give the table a few more minutes?" I heard that sentence the way you hear something when every part of you is paying attention. He meant, please just absorb this one. I knew how to translate Malcolm after 6 years, and the translation that had once felt like patience now felt, standing there in my wet coat with the empty stockpot behind him, like something I was no longer willing to offer. I walked into the room. I set my bag on the counter. I looked at the plate of shells. I looked at the Chardonnay. I looked at Paulette, who was already pivoting back toward her guests, already resettling herself, as though my entrance was a brief interruption to the evening rather than the actual end of it. And then I put my hand flat on the dining table. I need everyone who doesn't live here to leave our home right now." I did not raise my voice. There was no need. The room went completely still. The woman with the silver bob stopped smiling. The two others, I would learn their names, were Brenda and Colette, both from Paulette's water aerobics class at the Burlington YMCA, went motionless. Malcolm set his wine glass down with a very small, very careful click. Paulette's expression moved through 3 stages: surprise, recalibration, and then the particular brittleness that settles into her face when she's been caught off balance and dislikes it. "Elise." "I'm not saying it twice," I said, "and I am genuinely sorry to the 3 of you. You didn't do anything wrong. You were invited somewhere, and you showed up. That's not on you." I looked at the woman with the silver bob. "I'm sorry your evening ended this way." She was already reaching for her purse. "Of course," she said, quietly and without argument. She touched Colette's arm. The 3rd woman was already standing. They were decent people who had put together, in the last minute, what kind of evening this actually was, and they left with the dignified efficiency of people who know when the right thing to do is simply go. 90 seconds, that's how long it took. I held the door open and said thank you to each of them because my mother raised me to be civil even when I am not okay, and I am still, in most circumstances, her daughter. I closed the door. The 3 of us stood in the apartment, the plate of shells, the open bottle, the rinsed-out pot. "That was completely uncalled for," Paulette said. Her voice had gone thin and hard. The warmth was packed away. "Those women drove 40 minutes in the dark. You humiliated me in front of my friends." "Paulette." I turned to face her fully. "Do you know what was in that pot?" "Lobster, which was sitting in the fridge, and I assumed. 2 Atlantic lobsters from the Dundas market, $88. I bought them at noon today because I got good news at work this morning, the first piece of genuinely good news I've had in 14 months. I thought about that dinner for the entire drive home. I let that sit for a moment. I came home and it was gone." "There's rice," she said. "There's." "Paulette." She stopped. I looked at Malcolm, who had not moved from the table. He was watching me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face in a long time. Not quite alarm, not quite recognition. Something between the two. "How long has your mother had a key to our condo?" I asked him. "About 2.5 years. And in 2.5 years, how many times has she come over without calling ahead?" A pause. "I don't know exactly." 38, I said. "I have the dates in my phone." I started keeping track after she reorganized the kitchen cupboards without asking, which I didn't bring up because I told myself she was trying to help. I looked at Paulette. I didn't bring up the phone calls to my work line either. I didn't bring up the winter coat she gave to the neighbor in 4B without asking me, the one I'd been meaning to take in for alterations. I didn't say anything when she told a client who called for me that I wasn't available and would call back. I had not told her to say that and I was available. I stopped. And I didn't say anything about the recipe binder. The temperature in the room changed. Malcolm had gone pale. He knew about the binder. I had told him the night it happened, and he had held my hand and called it an accident, and I had agreed that it was an accident, and we had both moved on. Except I hadn't moved on the same way he had. "The binder my mother kept on her counter for 30 years, I said, "with her handwriting in it. The one your mother found while she was tidying and decided was clutter." I kept my voice even. I know it wasn't intentional. I have chosen to believe that for 5 months. But it happened because you were in this home deciding what stays and what doesn't, without asking either of us. Just like tonight. Paulette's posture changed. Something deflated. She sat down heavily in the chair she'd claimed nearest the kitchen, like the standing had become too much. "I am trying," she said, and her voice was different now, smaller and harder to dismiss. I am trying to feel useful. Gerald has been gone 4 years, and I rattled around that house in Burlington all last spring by myself, and I retired thinking I would have people, and instead I have. She stopped, looked at the table. I just want to feel like I'm part of something. I know that, I said. And I was not performing compassion. I genuinely meant it. I understand that losing Gerald changed the shape of your entire life, and that the retirement happened at the same time, and that it's been genuinely hard. I have tried to make room for that because I knew it was real. But feeling lonely doesn't mean this condo belongs to you. It doesn't mean you get to decide what stays on our counter, or what goes in a donation box, or whose groceries get served to your water aerobics class. I met her eyes directly. You are not nothing, Paulette, but you are a guest in this home. A welcome one, but a guest. Malcolm stood up. He walked to the kitchen, put both hands on the counter, and stood there with his back to us. And I knew him well enough to know that he was doing the hard work of figuring out what he actually meant before he said it, which I had always respected about him, even when the waiting was difficult. He turned around. Mom, he said, I need you to go home tonight. Paulette looked at him. Malcolm. I'll come to Burlington on Saturday, he said. We'll talk properly, but right now I need you to go home. She left without saying anything more to me. She got her coat from the front closet and she left, and the door closed with a quiet, unremarkable sound that somehow felt larger than it should have. Malcolm and I stood in the apartment in the particular silence that follows something that has finally been said after a long time of not being said. He ordered Thai food from a place on James Street North, used Skip because neither of us had the energy for alternatives, and we ate it at the counter because neither of us wanted to sit at the dining table yet. He reheated some leftover rice from the pot on the stove, and we stood shoulder to shoulder in the kitchen, eating noodles from the containers with the lights low, and it was enough. It was more than enough. I told him I needed to know what happened when he went to Burlington. Not a summary, the actual conversation, what was said, both directions. He said that was fair. Saturday, he made the drive. He came home that evening and sat across from me at the kitchen table and told me everything with the kind of detail I had asked for and had never previously felt I could insist on. He told me that Paulette cried and that he let her cry without rushing past it. He told her, clearly, that the key needed to come back, that visiting our home from now on required calling ahead without exception. That our condo was ours and she was a guest in it. A loved guest. But a guest, and that he should have said this a long time ago and hadn't, and that was on him as much as anyone. He told her about a seniors art studio he'd found through the Hamilton-Burlington YMCA. Thursday mornings, drop in, no registration required. He brought the key home in his jacket pocket and set it on the kitchen counter between us. We looked at it for a moment. Then I put it in the kitchen drawer where we keep extra batteries and takeout menus, because that was where it could stay without meaning anything in particular. Paulette didn't contact me directly for almost 4 weeks. That was uncomfortable in the way that necessary things are often uncomfortable, and I let it be uncomfortable without reaching out to smooth it over, which was something new for me. When she finally called, she called my cell, not Malcolm's. She didn't open with a defense or a justification. She said, I owe you an apology. Several, I think. Her voice was level, so was mine. I said thank you, and I meant it, and we moved forward. She joined the art studio. She goes on Thursday mornings and most Saturdays, and she has made 2 friends there. Genuine ones, the kind who text her about things unrelated to family. She comes to our condo on Sunday afternoons when we invite her, and she calls first, always, without being reminded. She brings squares from the Fortino's bakery counter because she's learned that cooking in someone else's kitchen requires an invitation, and squares from a bakery require nothing but showing up. I stopped keeping the note on my phone, the one titled P, with 38 entries and 2.5 years of dates. I stopped about a month after that February evening, not because everything became perfect, because it didn't. And anyone who tells you that one clear conversation dismantles years of accommodation overnight is oversimplifying it for you. I stopped because I stopped needing the documentation to convince myself that my own experience was real. I had gathered those entries for myself, to look at on the days when I doubted my own perception, to prove to myself that I wasn't inventing the problem, that my home was being used in ways I hadn't agreed to, that I had the right to feel what I felt. The thing is, I had been carrying that evidence quietly for years and never understood that the point of it was never to present it to anyone. The point was to convince myself that what I was feeling was real, that this was my home, and that actually meant something. My mother's recipe binder is gone. I have made my peace with that, mostly. Last spring, I bought a new one, the same kind, a regular white Staples binder, and I've been filling it slowly, from memory and from my aunt in Guelph, who had some of the same recipes and found her copies in a box in her basement. It is not the same thing. I know it isn't. But it lives on the counter where a recipe binder belongs, and it is in no danger of being moved. The condo feels different now, not because everything is fixed. Relationships don't work that way, and Paulette is still Paulette, opinions and all. But the terms are clear in a way they weren't before, and clear terms have a way of making space feel like yours again. Last Sunday, she came for dinner and brought her friend from the studio, a woman named Audra, who makes ceramic bowls and talks about glaze temperatures with genuine enthusiasm. We ate pasta at the table with enough chairs for everyone, and Paulette asked before she went looking for the serving spoon, and I showed her where it was. A small thing. Not a small thing. I still have the stock pot on the same shelf. I used it for chili last week, a double batch I brought to a work potluck on Friday. I came home to a kitchen that looked exactly the way I had left it. Malcolm was on the couch, and he looked up when I came in and asked how the potluck went. I told him it went well. It did. The table seats 4 comfortably, 6 with the leaf in. Everyone who sits at it now knows whose home this is. Mine. Ours. The words mean the same thing when a home is working the way a home should.